10 cents a bottle, Rosalie said, holding his gaze without blinking. And before you ask, no, the milkmaid is not included in the price. Wade Callahan leaned against his doorframe flower on his shirt, smoke rolling out of his kitchen behind him, and looked at her like she was the most interesting problem he'd encountered in 35 years of living. What if I buy every bottle you have, he said slowly, and cook you breakfast in return? Rosalie had not smiled at a man in 3 years. She almost smiled now. Your kitchen is on fire, she said. I know, he said. That's why I need you. If stories about stubborn women and patient cowboys move something in you, subscribe, follow every part to the end, and tell me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches. The wagon wheels hit the rut at the bottom of Callahan Road, just as the sky was turning from black to the bruised purple that came before dawn in Dry Creek Valley. Rosalie Bennett had driven this stretch of road enough times that she didn't need light to feel where the ruts were. Her body knew them the same way it knew the weight of a full milk bottle, the resistance of a stuck separator, crank the particular silence that meant her Aunt Agnes had finally cried herself to sleep in the next room and would never admit it in the morning. She clicked her tongue at the mare. Bess didn't need encouragement, but Rosalie needed the sound. Something to fill the quiet that had been sitting on her chest since the letter arrived from the land office 3 weeks ago. 6 weeks. That was how long she had before the payment was due on the Bennett property. 6 weeks to produce $42 she did not have. The Bennett dairy had been bleeding slowly for a year. Not dramatically, not all at once, the way a wound you could press your hands against and stop. It was the other kind of bleeding. The quiet kind. A canceled order here. A lowered price there. 3 families on her morning route had sent polite notes saying they were switching to creamery delivery from Horace Bell's new operation in town. They apologized in their notes. Rosalie had folded those notes very carefully and fed them to the stove because she could not afford to waste paper and she could not afford to cry. The new stop at Callahan Ranch was supposed to help. She had added it 2 weeks ago when word went around that someone from Texas had opened the old place back up. She had expected an older man. Most of the ranchers in the valley were older men with wives who managed the household accounts and knew down to the penny what milk cost and whether it was worth buying local versus taking delivery from Bell's Creamery. Older ranchers' wives were Rosalie's best customers. They understood quality. They understood what it meant to buy from a neighbor rather than a company. She had not expected the man who appeared in the doorway. She had not expected him at all. Howe was standing with a coffee cup in his left hand and a skillet handle in his right, and there was flour on his shirt, in a diagonal streak that suggested he had either been in a fight with a flour sack or lost a bet. He was tall enough that the doorframe caught the top of his hat brim. Dark hair, a jaw that needed attention from a razor, eyes that were doing something she could not immediately categorize. Not unfriendly, not cautious, not the flat assessment of a man calculating the price of things. Something else. Something that looked almost like amusement. Morning, he said. Good morning. Rosalie kept her voice businesslike. She was good at businesslike. She had been practicing for 3 years. Rosalie Bennett, Bennett Dairy. I have your order 2 bottles of whole milk. Wade Callahan. He tilted his head slightly. I was hoping for 3. She had 2 extra bottles in the crate. She always kept 2 extra. She looked at the smoke beginning to curl from somewhere behind him in the kitchen and made a rapid calculation. 10 cents a bottle, she said. Reasonable. He didn't move from the doorway. Does the price include breakfast? Rosalie blinked. In 3 years of running the dairy route alone through mud seasons and hard winters and the particular misery of a Wyoming summer that turned the road to cracked clay by 9 in the morning, no customer had ever asked her that. Traveling salesmen had occasionally tipped their hats. Old Mr. Garrity on the far end of the route sometimes offered her a cup of coffee from the porch, which she always declined politely because stopping cost her time and time cost her money. But no one had looked at her the way this man was looking at her directly, with a kind of easy confidence that was not quite arrogance, and offered her breakfast like it was a fair trade. The price includes milk, Rosalie said. Of course. He nodded seriously, as if she had made a very reasonable point. But I've been trying to make biscuits since 4 this morning, and I've burned 3 batches, and I think a woman who gets up before dawn to handle dairy work probably knows something about biscuits, and I've got enough coffee for 2 and—" He paused. Behind him, the smoke thickened. "And I think my 4th batch may be past saving." Rosalie smelled it then. Not just smoke. The specific smell of something scorching on a cast-iron skillet that had gotten far too hot. She should have driven away. She knew that. She had deliveries waiting time running short, and absolutely no reason to step inside the kitchen of a stranger who was apparently incapable of managing a stove without incident. She was a professional. She had a schedule. She handed him the extra milk bottle, climbed down from the wagon, walked past him through the doorway, crossed the kitchen floor in 4 steps, pulled the skillet off the heat, and assessed the damage. The biscuits were not completely lost. 2 of them were salvageable, if you didn't mind the bottom crust being something close to charcoal. The other 4 were a different story. "How much flour do you have left?" she asked. Wade Callahan appeared at her elbow. He smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and something she couldn't name right away, something clean and outdoor and not unpleasant. "About half a sack," he said. "I may have used some for other purposes." He gestured vaguely at the diagonal streak on his shirt. "I can see that." Rosalie pulled the surviving biscuits onto a plate, found a cloth, and started over. She did not ask permission. The kitchen was a disaster in the making, and she did not have patience for disasters she could prevent. "Do you have lard?" "I have butter." "Better. Where?" He found it. She worked. He watched with the alert attention of someone taking notes, and she found to her own surprise that she didn't mind being watched. He didn't make comments. He didn't offer help she hadn't asked for. He simply watched and stayed out of her way, which was more than she could say for most people. "You always do that?" he asked when she had the 2nd batch in the oven. "Do what?" "Walk into a stranger's kitchen and take over." Rosalie turned to look at him directly for the first time since she'd passed him in the doorway. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, that same expression on his face, somewhere between amusement and something more genuine that she hadn't quite placed yet. "Your biscuits were burning," she said. "They were," he agreed. "And you were standing in the doorway." "I was." "Someone had to do something." "That's true." He pushed off the wall and went to pour 2 cups of coffee. He didn't ask if she wanted one. He just put one in front of her on the work table like it was already decided. "I appreciate a woman who acts on a problem instead of commenting on it." Rosalie picked up the coffee cup. It was good coffee. Stronger than she made for herself at home, because she rationed beans carefully, but strong coffee was not something she had enjoyed in a while. She didn't say that. "You're from Texas," she said instead. "Guilty." "You bought the Callahan place." "Inherited it. My uncle left it to me about 6 months ago. I spent 5 of those months deciding what to do with it, and 1 month getting here." He sat down across the work table from her with his own cup. "The valley's different from what I expected." "What did you expect?" He thought about it genuinely, which she noticed. Most people gave quick answers to questions like that. He actually considered it. "More open," he said finally. "Texas range is flat. You can see trouble coming from 2 miles away. Here," he glanced toward the window, "the hills crowd everything in. Feels like the land has opinions." Rosalie almost smiled. "It does." "You grew up here." "Born here. My father ran the dairy before me. His father before him." She kept her voice level. It was a fact, not a grief, even if sometimes those 2 things were hard to separate. "You took it over yourself." 3 years ago. I didn't say anything immediately, and she appreciated that too. People usually said something well-meaning and slightly wrong, like it must have been hard, or your father must have been proud, or you're doing a fine job for, and then they would catch themselves on the word. They'd been about to say the word that told her exactly how they thought about her, and the conversation would get awkward. Wade Callahan just said, 3 years is enough time to know a valley." "It is," she said. "So you know Horace Bell." The name landed between them differently than the rest of the conversation had. Rosalie felt her coffee cup stop halfway to her mouth. "I know who he is," she said carefully. "He came out here last week." Wade leaned back in his chair watching her face, and she had the feeling he was cataloging her reaction with the same attention he'd given to her biscuit method. Offered me a very generous price for the ranch. Said he wanted to expand his operations. Said the creek crossing on my property was a natural asset for any business moving product to the new depot. Rosalie set her coffee cup down very quietly. And what did you tell him? Told him I'd think about it. Wade's eyes didn't move from her face. What would you tell me to tell him? I'd tell you to think carefully about what Horace Bell's idea of a generous price actually costs. She heard her own voice come out harder than she intended, stripped of the careful neutrality she usually maintained. He bought out 3 dairy operations in this valley in the past 2 years. Every one of them took his price because they needed the money. Every one of them lost their land within a season because Bell's contracts have clauses that let him renegotiate terms after 6 months. Ask any of them how generous he was. Wade was quiet for a moment. You've been watching him, he said. Everyone who's still running their own operation has been watching him. She picked her coffee cup back up. We just can't prove anything yet. The biscuits came out right the second time. She could tell by the smell before she opened the oven, the particular warm, yeasty smell of bread that had risen properly and browned evenly. She pulled them out with a folded cloth and set them on the work table. Wade broke one open immediately, the way a man will when he's been waiting and not very patiently. That, he said, is what a biscuit is supposed to smell like. Yes, Rosalie agreed. It is. They ate at the work table, which was not the dining table in the front room, but felt more honest for that, a workspace shared by people who were accustomed to working. He found preserves in the pantry, dark cherry that someone had put up years ago, and which turned out to still be good. She showed him where he'd gone wrong with the lard-to-flour ratio and why the heat had been too high. He listened with actual attention, asked 2 specific questions, and did not argue with her conclusions. By the time she stood up to leave, the morning had moved further than she'd intended. I've got 3 more stops, she said, pulling on her work gloves. Of course. He walked with her to the wagon, which she had not asked him to do, but which did not feel presumptuous the way it might have with another man. Same time Thursday. If you want a delivery. I want a delivery. He picked up the empty crate from beside the door and handed it to her so she could pack her bottles. He did it naturally, like a man who understood the logistics of physical work without needing to perform understanding. And I'd like to ask you something, if that's all right. Rosalie waited. The thing you said about Bell, about proving something. He kept his voice low, though there was nobody around for 100 yards in any direction. If someone was going to start gathering that kind of evidence, what kind of evidence would they need? She looked at him for a moment. Flour still on his shirt. Eyes that were careful now, the amusement tucked away something steadier underneath. Weights, she said. Certified weights compared against Bell's receipts. And freight records. And testimony from the farmers who've been shortchanged. She paused. And somebody who Bell doesn't consider a threat. Wade looked at her steadily. Somebody like a Texas rancher who just inherited a property, he said slowly, and who Bell thinks he's about to buy. The morning birds had started up in the cottonwoods along the creek. Rosalie could hear them, bright and ordinary, like nothing complicated was happening. I didn't say that, she said. No, Wade agreed. You didn't. She climbed up to the wagon seat. He stepped back, hands in his pockets, looking up at her with that expression she still hadn't fully classified. Thursday, he said. Thursday, she confirmed and clicked Bess forward. She did not look back. She was almost certain he watched her drive away. She was almost certain about the small, inconvenient warmth that had settled somewhere behind her sternum, which she intended to think about very carefully later when she had time, and then likely decide to ignore. She had $42 to find in 6 weeks. She did not have time for inconvenient warmth. But Bell's name was still echoing somewhere in the back of her mind, and the thought that had been half-formed for months was suddenly sharper, more defined, because someone had asked the right question at the right moment, with the right kind of steadiness behind his eyes. Somebody like a Texas rancher who Bell didn't consider a threat. She had been trying to fight Bell from inside his line of sight. She had been making herself visible, refusing to back down, holding her ground, all of which mattered, all of which was necessary, but it had not been enough. Bell knew exactly who Rosalie Bennett was and what she wanted. He had accounted for her. He had likely accounted for every independent dairy operator in the valley, because that was what men like Bell did. They planned, they purchased, they arranged the pieces on the board, while the people they were arranging against were too busy surviving to see the game. But he had not accounted for a newcomer with a creek crossing and a poker face and a gift for burning biscuits. By the time she reached her next delivery, 3 miles down the valley road, Rosalie's mind was already moving in a different direction. Still careful, still precise, still practical. But moving. She did not smile. She had too much to do for smiling. She smiled anyway. The second and third deliveries went quickly. Old Mrs. Patterson on the valley road always had exact change ready on the porch railing, which Rosalie appreciated enormously. And the Henricks family bought a full gallon and pressed a dozen eggs on her that she couldn't refuse without giving offense. So she arrived home with eggs she hadn't planned for, and a mind that was running faster than Bess. Agnes was in the kitchen when Rosalie came through the door. She had a pot of oatmeal on the stove that she navigated by sound and habit, and the exact placement of every object in that kitchen that had not moved in 30 years. Agnes Bennett was 58 years old, and her eyesight had been failing for 2 years, slowly, incrementally, like everything in the valley that declined under Bell's particular kind of patient pressure. She turned her head toward the door at Rosalie's step. "You're late," Agnes said. "Not by much, but late." New stop ran long. The Callahan place. Agnes had the particular gift of people who listened carefully. She heard things without being told them. "What's he like?" Rosalie set the eggs down on the counter and began checking the separator for the afternoon's work. "He burns his biscuits," she said. "That's not what I asked. He's from Texas. He's careful. He asks good questions." Rosalie turned to the separator. "He knows about Bell." Agnes was quiet for a moment. The oatmeal stirred itself slowly. "Knows about Bell how?" she said finally. "Bell approached him about buying the ranch. He told me." "He told you?" Agnes's voice had shifted slightly. Not alarmed. Something more like attention sharpened. "First visit?" "Yes." "Either he's very honest," Agnes said, "or he's very good at seeming honest." "I know." Rosalie had thought about this on the drive back. It had been the most important thing she'd thought about. More important than the warmth behind her sternum. More important than the fact that he'd known how to step back and give her room to work. "I haven't decided which yet." "But you're going back Thursday." It wasn't quite a question. "He ordered 3 bottles," Rosalie said. "I need every order I can hold." Agnes made a sound that wasn't quite a word, but contained an entire editorial. Rosalie chose not to respond to it. She began checking the equipment for the afternoon's work, moving efficiently through the familiar rhythm of the dairy, separating cleaning, checking the cold storage, counting what was ready for tomorrow's route. Every motion was calibrated to the smallest expenditure of time and effort, because time and effort were money, and money was what stood between them and losing everything their father and grandfather had built. $42. 6 weeks. She ran the numbers again in her head, the way she did every afternoon, as automatic and cheerless as breathing. The route brought in roughly $12 a month from remaining customers. She could stretch that to perhaps 14 if the new Callahan order held. She had $6 saved in the tin box under the floorboard in the dairy room. She could sell 2 of the older milk crates to the hardware man who had mentioned wanting them for storing tools. That was perhaps another $1.50. Which left her at the absolute best calculation about $18 short of what she needed in a time frame that did not allow for miracles. She had known this. She had known it for weeks. But knowing a number and feeling it were different things, and this afternoon, for some reason, she preferred not to examine the number, felt less like a wall and more like a problem someone might solve. That was dangerous thinking. Dangerous thinking led to depending on outcomes that hadn't happened yet, and outcomes that hadn't happened yet were not money in a tin box under a floorboard. She kept working. That evening, after Agnes had gone to bed, and the dairy was clean, and the next morning's bottles were ready in the cold storage, Rosalie sat at the kitchen table with her father's old ledger books spread in front of her. She'd been reviewing them for months, ever since she'd started noticing the discrepancies. The numbers told a story, but it was a story in pieces, missing the thread that would tie everything together into something a court or a land office or a marshal would take seriously. Her father, Thomas Bennett, had kept meticulous records. Every delivery, every weight, every price, every customer, every season going back 15 years. He had not been a suspicious man. He had kept records because he was orderly, because his father had taught him that a business that didn't know its own numbers was a business already in trouble. He had not known when he carefully noted each entry in his cramped, precise handwriting that his records might someday become evidence. But they were. Rosalie was increasingly certain of it. She found the first discrepancy. The first one she was almost sure was deliberate in a delivery from 4 years ago, when Bell had just taken over the old creamery and renamed it. 12 pounds of cream delivered and receipted, but the payment reflected only 9. The difference was small enough to be dismissed as an error. Small enough that her father had probably noted it with a frown and let it go. Small enough that Bell had counted on exactly that. But then there was another one. 3 months later. Then another 6 weeks after that. Always small. Always within the margin that a tired farmer might write off as a measuring error or a bad scale reading. Always adding up. Rosalie had been adding them up. Over 14 months. The period she'd been able to document clearly, the Bennett dairy alone had lost what she calculated to be approximately $8.40 to Bell's false measurements. $8.40. Not a catastrophic loss. Not the kind of number that made a man angry enough to take action. But multiply that by every independent dairy in the valley, 6, 7, maybe 8, still operating, and the ones that had already closed, and the number grew into something different. Something deliberate. Something that would have purchased Bell considerable comfort over the years, while the families it came from squeezed their budgets and canceled orders and quietly fell behind. She put her pencil down and pressed her palms flat on the table. She needed corroborating records. She needed the other farmers' receipts, compared against independently verified weights. She needed someone who could get access to Bell's internal ledgers without Bell knowing it was happening. And she needed to do all of it before the land payment was due, or any victory she managed would be personal satisfaction for a woman with no address. The creek crossing on Callahan Ranch is a natural asset for any business moving product to the new depot. Wade's voice in her memory was very clear. She had a good memory for voices. It came from growing up with Agnes, who communicated as much in tone as in words. Bell wanted that crossing. He had not purchased the Callahan property yet, which meant either Wade had actually told him he'd think about it, or Bell was planning a different approach if patience failed. Bell's patience did not fail often, but when it did, the response was calculated. Not violent, not obvious, but quietly, precisely harmful. Like a valve slowly shut on a water line. Like a scale thumb pressed so gently that the needle barely moved. Rosalie closed her father's ledger very carefully. Thursday was 4 days away. She had 4 days to decide how much she trusted a man who burned his biscuits and asked the right questions, and had flour on his shirt and eyes that were careful in a way she hadn't seen before. 4 days was not very long. It was also not nothing. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. And in the space between waking and sleep, she did not think about the warmth behind her sternum, or the way he'd known to step back and give her room. She thought about numbers, about weights and receipts, and the specific careful architecture of a plan that had to be built without any single piece of it failing. She was almost asleep before she admitted very briefly, and to no one but herself, that she was going to trust him. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. Enough to try. And somewhere across the dark valley in a ranch house that still smelled of burned biscuits and good coffee. Wade Callahan sat with his own papers spread across a work table and thought about a woman who had walked into his kitchen and fixed what needed fixing without asking for permission or credit, and wrote down a name. Horace Bell. And underneath it, in the careful hand of a man accustomed to reading terrain and calculating risk, creek crossing, freight records, weights. He underlined the last word twice. Then he put his pencil down, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Outside the valley held its breath in the last dark before another dawn. The cottonwoods were still. The creek ran quiet along the property line between what Bell wanted and what Wade had no intention of giving him. Somewhere down the road, a milk wagon sat ready for morning. The valley had opinions, Wade had said. He was beginning to understand what it meant. Thursday came the way. Mornings in the valley always did, without ceremony, without permission, with a cold that bit through wool and made Bess snort steam into the dark air. Rosalie had been awake since 3. She had not slept well. She had not slept well since Tuesday when she'd sat at the kitchen table with her father's ledgers and made the decision that 4 days suddenly felt too short to properly examine. She loaded the wagon in the dark, working by touch and habit, counting bottles by the sound of glass against wood. 3 for Callahan Ranch. She had counted them twice before she admitted to herself that she'd been thinking about the order since yesterday afternoon and should probably stop pretending otherwise. Agnes appeared in the dairy doorway with 2 cups of coffee before Rosalie had finished loading. "You're fidgeting," Agnes said. "I'm loading. You've checked that crate 3 times. That's fidgeting with extra steps." Agnes held out a cup. "Drink this. You'll think clearer." Rosalie took the cup. Agnes had always been able to hear things Rosalie didn't say. It had been mildly inconvenient her entire life, and considerably more so in the past 3 years. "I'm going to ask Wade Callahan some questions today," Rosalie said, because there was no point pretending otherwise, and the coffee gave her something to hold on to. "About Bell. About what Bell said to him specifically." "Good." Agnes sipped her own coffee. "And if he gives you straight answers, then I'll give him straight answers back. And if he doesn't," Rosalie finished the coffee and handed the cup back, "then I'll know that too." Agnes nodded, and in that nod was everything that had passed between them in 3 years of running the dairy alone together. Every hard morning, every canceled order, every number that didn't add up. It was the nod of a woman who trusted her niece's judgment even when she was worried about it. "Don't fix his breakfast again," Agnes said. "Let him manage his own kitchen." "I wasn't planning to," Rosalie said, which was not entirely true, and which Agnes absolutely knew. The road to Callahan Ranch was still dark when she turned onto it, but there was a lamp burning in the kitchen window. She noticed that before she noticed anything else, the simple fact that he was already up, already awake, that the light was on. She could not explain why that felt significant, and she chose not to try. He was on the porch when she pulled up. No coffee cup this morning, no flour on his shirt. He'd clearly made an effort, which she noticed without commenting on. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She climbed down and handed him the crate. 3 bottles, 30 cents. He took the crate, reached into his shirt pocket, and produced exact change. She noticed that too, the preparedness of it, the fact that he'd thought ahead. Men who thought ahead about small things usually thought ahead about large ones. "I made biscuits," he said. "Successfully this time. 2nd attempt was edible. 3rd batch I'd consider an achievement." Despite herself, Rosalie almost smiled. "What changed?" "Followed your instructions." He tilted his head toward the door. "Come see if I got it right." She should have said no. She had questions to ask, and a schedule to keep, and $42 to find, and absolutely no logical reason to walk into that kitchen again. She walked in anyway. He had gotten it right. The biscuits were even browned, correctly risen properly. She broke one open, and the interior was exactly what it should be, soft layered, still warm. She ate half of it before she registered that she was eating, and that he was watching her with an expression of barely contained satisfaction. "Don't look so pleased," she said. "I'm going to look exactly as pleased as I feel," he said, and poured coffee without asking. "Sit down. I want to tell you what Bell said to me, and I want you to hear all of it, not just the part I think matters." That got her attention more than the biscuits had. She sat down. Wade sat across from her with his coffee and spoke carefully and completely, the way a man speaks when he's decided that the truth is more useful than a good impression. Bell had come on a Tuesday, he said. Arrived unannounced, which Wade had noted. "A man who came unannounced either believed his time was more valuable than yours or wanted to catch you unprepared." Bell's manner had been pleasant, very pleasant, the kind of pleasant that took effort. He'd complimented the property, expressed admiration for the creek, spoken about his creamery expansion, with the tone of a man describing a civic improvement rather than a business acquisition. The price Bell had named was nearly 30% above what Wade had estimated the property's fair market value to be. 30% above, Rosalie said. At minimum. Wade's eyes were steady. I've been in enough cattle deals to know when a price is built to make you stop asking questions. A fair price makes you think. An inflated price makes you grateful. Bell wanted me grateful. Did he say anything about the creek crossing specifically? He called it a natural corridor. Said whoever controlled the route between the northern farms and the depot would control product flow for the whole valley. He said it like he was sharing useful information. He wasn't sharing useful information. He was telling you what he needed from you, Rosalie said, so you'd understand you had something he wanted, and I'd feel powerful enough to sell it to him at his price. Wade set his cup down. I've met men like Bell before. Different business, same architecture. They make you feel like you're winning the negotiation. Rosalie looked at him directly. You said you'd think about it. I said I'd think about it because I needed time to find out who in this valley I could talk to honestly. He met her look without flinching. You were the first person who mentioned his name without me bringing it up. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Outside, Bess shifted her weight in the traces, and the wagon creaked softly. What do you want out of this? Rosalie asked, and she meant it without softness. She meant it as the real question, the one that mattered more than any other. If we go after Bell, if this becomes a real fight with real consequences, what do you want from it? Wade was quiet long enough that she knew he wasn't manufacturing an answer. He was finding the true one. I want to build something here that lasts, he said finally. I'm not interested in running Bell off so I can fill his position. I don't want to control the creek crossing for profit. I want to run cattle, keep my ranch in honest shape, and not spend the next 20 years watching my neighbors lose what their parents built, because one man decided the rules didn't apply to him. He paused. And I want to get to know you better, which is a separate thing, but which I'm mentioning because I believe in being clear. Rosalie did not respond to the last part immediately. She filed it in a careful internal drawer and returned to the business of the situation. I need to talk to the other dairy farmers, she said. The ones still operating. If they'll share their receipt records with me and let me compare them against certified weights, I can build a picture of what Bell's been taking. But I need someone who can get close to Bell's freight records without raising suspicion. Someone like a Texas rancher thinking about selling his property, Wade said. Someone like that, yes. She looked at him steadily. Bell will invite you to his office if he thinks the sale is moving forward. His freight ledgers will be in that office. I need to know what's in them. You want me to read his books while he thinks I'm signing his paperwork? I want you to remember what you see. You won't be able to take anything. Just remember it. What am I looking for? Discrepancies between incoming milk weights and outgoing cream and butter production. If Bell is falsifying intake weights, his production numbers will be too high compared to what he claims to receive. The math doesn't lie if you know what you're calculating. She paused. Can you read a freight ledger? I ran cattle drives for 11 years, Wade said. I can read any ledger you put in front of me. She believed him. She believed him in the specific practical way she believed in things that had demonstrated their reliability. The same way she believed in a good separator crank and a proven recipe and a horse that had never once shied at a loud sound. Thursday visits, she said. We use them to share information. No one will think twice about the dairymaid making her delivery. And the other mornings, Wade asked. The other mornings I'm working, of course. He nodded. There was something in his expression that was careful and amused and respectful all at once. A combination she was beginning to recognize as simply him. Thursday mornings. She stood up to leave, and he walked her to the wagon again and again. It did not feel presumptuous. It felt like a man who had been raised to have manners, and who had decided that manners were worth keeping even when no one was watching. Your aunt, he said when she'd climbed up to the seat. How long has she had trouble with her eyes? Rosalie paused. She had not mentioned Agnes's eyes. She thought back through the conversation and could not find the moment she'd said it. I didn't tell you that, she said. No. Wade looked up at her, easy and direct. Agnes Bennett's eyesight has been failing for 2 years. It's known in town. Bell mentioned it actually when he was talking about the dairy. He mentioned it the way a man mentions a vulnerability he's already accounted for. The cold that moved through Rosalie then had nothing to do with the morning air. He mentioned Agnes, she said. He mentioned that the Bennett operation was running on limited resources and that the senior partner was no longer fully capable. Wade's voice was quiet, but very precise. He said it like he was being sympathetic. Rosalie's hands tightened on the reins. Bess felt the tension and shifted her ears back, waiting. Agnes is not a liability, Rosalie said. Her voice came out very controlled, and she was proud of that. No, Wade said. She's not. But Bell's already decided she is, and that tells us something important about how he thinks. He held her gaze. He thinks you're alone. He's built his whole approach around you being alone. The words landed with a weight that was not sadness, but something older and more practical. The recognition of a strategy being revealed like a hand of cards turned face up on a table. Then he's miscalculated, Rosalie said. Considerably. Wade agreed. She drove away. This time she let herself look back once briefly. He was still standing by the gate watching her go, one hand resting on the fence post. The lamp was still burning in the kitchen window behind him. She turned back to the road and did not think about it again until she reached Mrs. Patterson's house, where she collected her 30 cents and found herself being asked with the gentle persistence of a woman who had lived in a small valley long enough to notice everything, whether she'd heard that the new Callahan man was settling in well. I've heard he makes a decent biscuit, Rosalie said. Mrs. Patterson's smile was a small private thing she directed at the coins she was counting. Is that so? She said. The next 2 weeks moved at a pace that felt nothing like the years before them. Rosalie had operated on survival time for so long, the tight, economical rhythm of a person who cannot afford a wasted hour, that she had forgotten what it felt like to work towards something, rather than simply away from something else. She visited 4 of the valley's remaining independent dairy farmers. She went in the afternoons after the morning route and the dairy work when the light was going golden and people were more likely to be tired enough to be honest. She brought her father's ledgers. She did not immediately show them, she asked questions first. How long had they been selling to Bell's Creamery? Had their payments felt consistent? Had they ever questioned a weight reading? The answers were careful at first. Farmers in small valleys learned caution the same way they learned everything else, by watching what happened to the ones who weren't. But Tom Garrett, who ran 40 cows on the south side of the valley, and had the specific bluntness of a man who had stopped caring what people thought of him sometime around his 60th birthday, looked at her father's ledger numbers and said without any particular drama, "Those are my numbers, those are exactly my numbers." And then Rosalie showed him her calculations. The silence in Garrett's kitchen lasted long enough that his wife came in from the next room to check that he hadn't fallen asleep sitting up, which was apparently a concern. 8 months, Garrett said. He's been doing it for at least 8 months. At least that, Rosalie said. I believe it goes back further. I have my father's records showing patterns starting about 4 years ago, but the evidence becomes clear about 8 months back. 4 years. Garrett said it slowly, like a man counting something he'd lost track of. 4 years I've been short-weighted, and I never... He stopped. How much? Rosalie showed him the calculation. He looked at it for a long time. My son was going to go to school in Cheyenne, he said finally. His voice was very flat and even. We couldn't afford it. We thought the dairy wasn't producing enough. Rosalie did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would be adequate. She let the number sit on the table between them and do its own work. What do you need from me? Garrett asked. Your receipts, she said. Every receipt you have from Bell's Creamery. And I need to know that when the time comes, you'll testify to what you know. When the time comes, he repeated. I don't have everything I need yet. I'm working on it. But when I do, I'll come back. Garrett looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has decided to extend trust against his better judgment, because the alternative is continuing to lose. All right, he said. She collected receipts from 3 other farmers in the following week. Each conversation was different. Margaret Hale, who was 63 and had been running her late husband's dairy operation alone for 8 years, had already noticed the discrepancies and had said nothing because she assumed she had made an error in her own records and was too proud to admit confusion. When Rosalie showed her the pattern, Margaret Hale sat very straight in her chair and said, "I want to look him in the eye when he's convicted." "So do I," Rosalie said. The Thursday visits with Wade became something she stopped pretending were purely professional after the third one. Not because anything improper happened, nothing did, but because the quality of the time changed in a way she couldn't attribute to business alone. He asked questions that mattered. He remembered things she had mentioned in previous conversations without needing to be reminded. He brought problems to her that he was genuinely uncertain about decisions, about the ranch, about fencing and cattle, and the right approach to the creek bank, and listened to her responses with the kind of attention that communicated he valued her judgment, not as a courtesy, but as an actual resource. She found herself thinking with an alarm she recognized as protective instinct that she had not been careful enough. She had told herself she was managing the situation. She had told herself she was keeping appropriate distance, maintaining the practical perspective of a woman with $42 to find and a dairy to run and a cooperative to build and no margin for distraction. She had been wrong. She had not been managing anything. She had been sitting across a work table from a man she was coming to understand with increasing precision, and understanding led to trust. And trust was not something she had distributed carelessly since her father died. She did not know what to do with this realization. She filed it in the careful internal drawer along with everything else she was not ready to act on yet. What she could act on was the evidence. And Thursday of the fourth week, Wade walked into the kitchen while she was comparing receipt figures and said very quietly, "I went to see Bell yesterday." Rosalie put her pencil down. "His office," Wade said, sitting across from her. "I told him I'd been thinking about the sale, that I'd like to discuss specifics." He folded his hands on the table. "He has 3 ledgers in a cabinet behind his desk. He left me alone in the office for about 4 minutes while he went to get the contract paperwork." 4 minutes, Rosalie said. "I have a good memory." He met her eyes. "You told me to look for discrepancies between incoming weights and outgoing production." In the September through December entries for last year, Bell's Creamery claimed to process 4,312 pounds of milk from Valley Farms. His butter and cream production records, which he keeps in a separate column, show output that would require approximately 5,100 pounds of milk to produce. Rosalie felt the number settle in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. "Nearly 800 pounds, she said. 812 by my count." Wade's voice was completely level. That milk was Wade receipted and paid for at a loss to the farmers. Bell's receipts show he received it. His production numbers show he processed significantly more than he received. Which means he was either receiving unrecorded deliveries or falsifying the incoming weights so he could pocket the difference on the resale end. Wade finished. "Yes." Rosalie stood up from the table. She needed to move, needed to do something with the energy that had suddenly come into her body at the specific vivid sensation of a puzzle piece dropping into exactly the right place. "He's running 2 frauds simultaneously," she said. "He under-records incoming milk on the farmer's receipts, so he pays them less. Then he over-records his production output on the freight manifests, so he charges the railroad more for delivery. He's taking from both ends. Which explains why he needs the creek crossing," Wade said. "If he controls the route to the depot, he controls who sees his freight manifests and who doesn't. The railroad agent in the next county is reviewing what Bell sends him. If there's a local agent who can compare the depot manifests against what actually comes through the crossing. He needs that crossing before anyone starts asking the right questions," Rosalie finished. She turned back to the table. Wade was watching her with an expression that was not amusement this time. It was something steadier and more serious, the face of a man who has decided which side of a line he's standing on and is not uncertain about it. "I need to take this to the other farmers," she said, "and I need to write to the Territorial Land Office about certified scale requirements. If I can get an official certification done on Bell's receiving scale before he realizes what we're doing." "I can arrange that," Wade said. "I know the circuit inspector. He came through my uncle's ranch in Texas 3 years ago, and we kept in correspondence. If I write to him directly, rather than through the county office, Bell won't hear about the request through official channels. Rosalie looked at him. You have a connection to the circuit inspector, she said. I have connections to a number of people, Wade said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite defensive and not quite modest. I've been around long enough to know that who you know matters as much as what you know. I've been thinking about how useful some of those connections might be out here. She sat back down. She pulled her receipt records toward her and began making a new list, what she had, what she still needed, what the order of operations would have to be to build this case without Bell catching the shape of it before they were ready. If we move too soon, she said, he'll have time to alter the records. He's done it before. I can see places in his older receipts where numbers have been corrected. Then we don't move until we have everything we need, Wade said. Every receipt, every certified weight, the freight records from my memory, your father's ledgers, testimony from Garrett and the others. And we need it all to happen fast enough that the land payment doesn't destroy the dairy before we can use any of it. Rosalie heard the flatness in her own voice. She had not intended to say that part out loud. Wade was quiet for a moment. How short are you? He asked. That's not, Rosalie. His voice was very even. I'm not offering charity. I'm asking a logistical question because if the payment comes due before we're ready, our entire strategy falls apart. How short are you? She looked at him. He looked back. He did not look sympathetic. He looked practical, which was considerably easier to accept. Roughly $18, she said. At the outside. Wade nodded once. He said nothing else about it. But the following Monday, not a Thursday, which broke the schedule and required her to wonder about it for 3 days afterward, Rosalie arrived at the Henricks farmhouse on her route to find that the family had extended their order from 1 gallon per week to 2, effective immediately. Old Mr. Henricks, when she asked carefully what had prompted the change, mentioned that a man from the Callahan Ranch had stopped by to ask if they were satisfied with their milk delivery, and had mentioned that the Bennett dairy would be expanding distribution to additional ranch accounts, and so if they wanted to secure a regular order at the current price, now was a favorable time. Rosalie sat with that information all the way to her next delivery. He had not offered her money. He had not made himself a creditor. He had found a way to put money into her business, through the business itself, through expanding her customer base, through creating demand, through using his connections to do exactly what he'd said he wanted to do, and nothing more. She thought about that for the rest of the morning. She thought about the specificity of it, the care in it, the difference between a man who wanted to solve her problem because it made him feel useful, and a man who wanted to solve her problem in a way that left her standing in exactly the same place she'd been standing before, only with better numbers. She thought about what her aunt would say. Agnes would say she was thinking too much. Agnes would also say that a man who pays attention to the shape of a woman's pride is a man worth paying attention to back. Agnes had been known to be right about things. The circuit inspector replied to Wade's letter the following Wednesday. He would be in the county in 3 weeks. He could visit Bell's creamery as part of a routine inspection, no advance notice required, standard, regulatory practice, and provide certified measurements of all receiving equipment. 3 weeks. The land payment was due in 4. Rosalie finished reading the letter that Wade had written out to show her at the dairy, standing in the doorway of the milk house in the early afternoon light, and felt something she had not felt in longer than she could accurately remember. Not relief, not yet, because there was too much still to be done for relief. But the specific physical sensation of a plan, with enough pieces in place to be called a plan, rather than a hope. She looked up from the letter. Wade was watching her with that expression, the careful one, the one that was a question without being asked. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks, he confirmed. Bell can't know the inspector is coming. He won't. Not from me, not from the inspector's office. The request is logged under a routine district review. She handed the letter back to him. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. We need to tell the farmers, she said. Not all of it, not yet, but enough so they're ready. I'll ride to Garrett's tomorrow. I'll take Hale and the Collier family. She paused. You should know that Margaret Hale has already written down her testimony. Every delivery, Every weight, every payment, every date she remembers, questioning a reading and being told she was mistaken. She did it herself without being asked. She's been ready for this for 2 years. Wade was quiet for a moment. "How many people has Bell hurt in this valley?" he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Enough," Rosalie said. "More than enough." He was still for another moment, not the stillness of a man who doesn't feel things, but of one who processes them internally and doesn't mistake feeling for action. Then he said quietly, "We're going to have to be careful these next 3 weeks. If Bell notices that his sale is not progressing, if he starts watching the dairy more closely." "He's already watching," Rosalie said. She had known this for weeks. She had noticed the unfamiliar horse on the far ridge twice in the past 10 days there in the morning and gone by midday. She had said nothing about it because saying it out loud gave it a weight she wasn't ready to manage alongside everything else. "I've seen his man on the ridge above the back pasture." Wade's expression shifted in a way she hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, but something below anger, something older and more serious. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because I needed to be certain," she said, "and because I didn't want to panic before I had something to do about it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Rosalie," he said. "Wade," she said back evenly. Another moment. Then the expression settled into something that was almost resignation, and almost respect, and entirely him. "All right," he said. "What do we do about the man on the ridge?" "We let him watch," she said. "We give him something ordinary to report back. We don't change the routine. We don't show Bell that we know he's watching." She met Wade's eyes. "The moment Bell thinks we're aware of him, he changes his approach. Right now, he thinks he's invisible. That's our advantage." Wade was quiet again. Then very slowly he nodded. "You've been thinking like this for months," he said. "I've been thinking like this for 3 years," she said. "I just finally have someone who can execute the parts I couldn't reach alone." Something moved across his face at that something she saw and catalogued and did not comment on, but did not dismiss either. She went back to work. He left. The afternoon moved toward evening in the particular way of late summer in the valley light, going long and golden across the hills, the dairy cool and orderly around her as she moved through the end-of-day tasks. She thought about the man on the ridge. She thought about the land payment and the 3 weeks and the circuit inspector and Tom Garrett's son, who should have gone to school in Cheyenne. She thought about Wade Callahan, folding a letter back into his shirt pocket, with the particular care of a man who understood that some things needed to be kept close. And somewhere in between the counting and the planning and the careful management of everything. She could not afford to get wrong. She admitted to herself just once quietly, in the way she admitted things she was not ready to act on, that she was not afraid of what was coming. She was afraid of something else entirely. Something smaller and more stubborn and considerably harder to fight off than Horace Bell had ever been. She went inside and did not mention it to Agnes. Agnes, of course, already knew. The man on the ridge stopped appearing after the 2nd week. That was the thing that worried Rosalie more than his presence had. A watcher who disappears is not a watcher who has lost interest. A watcher who disappears is a watcher who has seen enough. She did not say this to Wade immediately. She turned it over in her mind for 2 days, examining it from every angle, the way she examined a suspect receipt, looking for the place where the numbers stopped adding up, where the pattern broke in a way that meant something deliberate rather than accidental. She said it to him on Thursday morning, standing in his kitchen with her coffee cup before he'd even finished pouring his own. "Bell pulled his man off the ridge," she said. Wade set the pot down carefully. "When?" 4 days ago. Maybe 5. She watched his face process it. "He's done watching. He's made a decision." "What kind of decision?" "I don't know yet. But men like Bell don't stop watching because they're satisfied. They stop watching because they've moved to the next stage." She set her cup down. "The inspector comes in 11 days. We may not have 11 days anymore." Wade was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. She counted them, had started counting his silences because the length of them told her things. "What do you need to do first?" he said. "I need to get to Margaret Hale today, and I need you to ride to Garrett and tell him to move his receipt records somewhere Bell's men can't reach them." She picked her cup back up because her hands needed something to do. "And I need to send a letter to the Territorial Land Office today, not next week. If Bell is going to move, I want something on record before he does." "What kind of record?" "A formal complaint. My name, my father's ledger evidence, the discrepancy calculations." She met his eyes. "It won't stop him immediately, but it creates a paper trail that says we acted first. If Bell tries to discredit us later, the dates matter." Wade nodded once the short, decisive nod she had come to recognize as him moving from considering a thing to doing it. "I'll ride to Garrett this morning," he said, "right after you leave. Don't go directly. Take the long way around the south pasture." She hesitated. "Bell knows your property borders mine. If his men see you riding a direct line to Garrett's, they'll understand what it means." Wade looked at her steadily. "You've been thinking about this all night." "I've been thinking about this for 3 days." She pulled on her work gloves. "I'll be at Hale's by mid-morning. Send word to me there if anything changes." She drove to Margaret Hale's farm with Bess moving faster than usual because she had pushed the pace without thinking, and thinking about it didn't make her slow down. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of clarity that felt like a warning rather than a promise. Margaret Hale met her at the gate before she'd finished pulling up, which told Rosalie that Margaret Hale had also been awake early and thinking about the same things. "Something's happened," Margaret said. It was not a question. "Not yet," Rosalie said. "But I think it's coming." She climbed down. "Are your receipts safe?" "Locked in the strongbox in the floor of the milk house. Same place my husband kept the deed." Margaret studied her face with the particular intensity of a woman who has survived enough to read trouble approaching before it announces itself. "How bad?" "I don't know. That's what concerns me." Rosalie followed her inside. "Bell pulled his surveillance 2 days before I expected him to. That means he's either moving faster than his original plan or something changed his timeline." "What could change it?" Rosalie thought about the circuit inspector's letter. Wade's letter sent through personal connection rather than official channels. But official channels had clerks and clerks talked, and small valleys had long ears. "I'm not sure," she said, though she was beginning to be. "Has anyone approached you about your receipts? Anyone from town? Any of Bell's people? Anyone asking questions about your operation?" Margaret's expression shifted a small controlled movement that Rosalie almost missed. "Tell me," Rosalie said. 3 days ago." Margaret sat down at her kitchen table and folded her hands in front of her with the composure of a woman who had decided that composure was the only luxury she could still afford. "A man came from the land office. Said he was doing a routine review of dairy operation registrations in the county. Asked to see my production records." Rosalie's blood went cold. "Did you show him?" "I showed him my current production logs, not the historical receipts from Bell's creamery." Margaret's voice was very precise. "I told him those were in storage and not immediately accessible. He wrote something in his notebook and left." "A man from the land office," Rosalie said slowly. "Did he show you credentials?" "He showed me a card." Margaret paused. It had the county seal on it. County seal. Not territorial. Not federal. The county land office, which had exactly one clerk on staff whose name was Gerald Marsh, and Gerald Marsh had been known to share information with Horace Bell over card games on Friday evenings since the new creamery had opened 3 years ago. Rosalie pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed through the very specific rage that was trying to push its way up through her chest. "I was looking for your records," she said. "Bell sent him to find out what you have." Margaret was very still. "He didn't get them." "No, but now Bell knows you're holding something." Rosalie stood up. "We need to move. Today. Not next week. Not when we're perfectly ready. Today." Margaret looked at her. "Is it enough, what we have?" "It has to be." Rosalie picked up her gloves from the table. "Can you get to Garrett's farm by afternoon? Bring your receipts, everything you have." "I can." "Don't come by the main road. Use the back trail along the creek." Margaret Hale stood up from her table with the precise, deliberate movement of a woman who has decided something permanent. My husband built this farm in 1871, she said. Bell has been stealing from it for 4 years. She looked at Rosalie with eyes that were entirely clear and entirely hard. Tell me what to do next. Rosalie told her. She drove back toward the dairy faster than was strictly safe on a road with the ruts it had. Bess's ears flat back against her head at the pace being asked of her. Rosalie was calculating. 3 weeks had become 11 days, and 11 days had become today. And today meant she had to work with what she had rather than what she'd hoped to gather. What she had was this: her father's ledgers, 4 years of documented discrepancies. Receipt records from Margaret Hale, Tom Garrett, and 2 other farmers. Wade's testimony about Bell's freight ledger numbers. A letter to the Territorial Land Office that she had not yet sent, but had written twice in draft form. And Agnes with her careful, precise mind, and her 30 years of watching the valley, and her memory for details that most people would have let slip. What she still needed was corroboration on the freight end. A witness who had seen Bell's actual production output, compared against what the railroad depot received. And she needed it before Bell moved to whatever the next stage of his plan was. She was halfway home when she saw the wagon. It was parked at an angle she didn't recognize on the access road that ran along the back of the Bennett property. Not a road most people would know about, not one that appeared on any official survey, because her grandfather had cut it himself decades ago through the back pasture to reach the creek. A road that anyone studying the Bennett property carefully would eventually find. 2 men were standing near the dairy building. Rosalie did not stop. She drove past the main turn, continued another quarter mile, and pulled Bess behind the Ellison windbreak, where the wagon would not be visible from the road. She sat still for exactly 30 seconds, letting her heartbeat settle to something functional. Then she climbed down, tied Bess to the fence post, and walked back through the pasture on foot, staying below the ridgeline. She came around the back of the dairy building in time to hear one of the men trying the door. "It's locked," said one. "So pick it," said the other. She recognized the second voice. It was Pete Dawes, one of Bell's creamery workers, a man she had seen twice loading barrels at the Bell operation in town. Medium height, wide shoulders, the particular economy of movement of someone accustomed to physical labor. She did not hesitate. "That door," Rosalie said from behind them, in the voice she normally reserved for customers who questioned her prices, "is locked because it belongs to me." Both men turned. Pete Dawes had the grace to look caught out. The other man, younger, not someone she recognized, took a step back. "Miss Bennett," Dawes said, recovering faster than she expected. "We were just checking on Mr. Bell. Asked us to evaluate the property for a possible lease arrangement." "Mr. Bell has no lease arrangement with me," Rosalie said. "He has no arrangement with me of any kind. And the next time I find someone on my property without my permission, I will be speaking to the marshal in Red Bluff before the day is out." She held Pete Dawes's gaze without blinking. "Are we clear?" Dawes looked at her for a moment with the particular calculation of a man deciding how much a threat is worth. He apparently decided this one was worth enough. "Mr. Bell will want to speak with you," he said. "Mr. Bell knows where to find me," Rosalie said. "During business hours, at the front gate, alone." They left. She watched them go until the wagon was out of sight down the road, then turned and went inside through the back door that she had not told them about, the one that connected directly to the dairy room, the one her father had added for exactly this kind of purpose, because he had understood that a person sometimes needs a door no one else knows is there. Agnes was in the kitchen. She had heard the wagon. She had, Rosalie realized, heard the entire exchange through the window she'd cracked open at the sound of voices. "Pete Dawes," Agnes said. "Yes." "Bell sent him to look for your records." "Yes." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said with the absolute composure of a woman who had arrived at the end of something that had been building for a long time, "He knows we're coming for him." "He suspects," Rosalie said. "There's a difference. If he knew, he'd have moved faster." She sat down at the kitchen table. Her legs were steady. She was proud of that. "I need to write that letter to the territorial office right now, and I need to find Wade." "Wade is in the front pasture," Agnes said. Rosalie looked at her. "He rode over an hour ago," Agnes said. "I told him you'd gone to Hale's. He said he'd wait." She paused. He mended the broken fence post along the north run while he waited. I watched him from the window. He did it correctly. Rosalie pressed her lips together to prevent the expression that was trying to form on her face. Agnes, she said. I'm simply reporting what I observed, Agnes said with great dignity. She went out to the front pasture and found Wade exactly where Agnes had said he would be, working his way back from the fence line with a mallet still in his hand and sawdust on his sleeve. He saw her face before she said a word. What happened? He said. She told him. All of it. Margaret's visit from the land office man, the two men at the dairy door, Pete Dawes, and his story about a lease arrangement. Wade listened without interrupting. Which she had come to understand was not passive, but its own form of intensity, the concentration of a man who was absorbing information and calculating simultaneously. He's moving the timeline, Wade said when she'd finished. He's panicking, Rosalie said. That's different from moving the timeline. Men like Bell plan for everything except being found out. The moment they realize someone has been watching them the way they've been watching everyone else, they make mistakes. What kind of mistakes? Overreach. She looked at him directly. He sent two men to a woman's property in broad daylight. That's not careful. That's desperate. She paused. Which means something spooked him, something specific. Wade was very still. The inspector's letter, he said. Did you send it through anyone else? Anyone who might have mentioned it? No. His voice was certain. I wrote it by hand, sealed it myself, gave it to the mail rider on the Tuesday route. No one else touched it. The mail rider, Rosalie said. Another silence. Wade put down the mallet. Jim Pryor, he said slowly. He covers this route and the route through Red Bluff. He stops at Bell's Creamery on the Red Bluff side. Bell has an outgoing account with the Postal Service for his freight correspondence. Rosalie stared at him. Jim Pryor opens mail, she said. I don't know that. But Bell could have offered him money to flag anything with the inspector's office seal. She pressed her hand against her forehead. If Bell saw that letter, if he knows the inspector is coming, he'll move to cover his records before the inspection, Wade said. Or he'll try to have the inspection canceled through the county office. Gerald Marsh, Rosalie said. Bell's card game friend. Who has the authority to file a postponement request? Wade picked up the mallet again, not to use it, just to have something in his hands. If Bell gets to Marsh before we get to the inspector, then the inspection gets delayed. Bell has time to alter his ledgers, and we lose our best evidence. Rosalie finished the sentence for him because sometimes finishing the hard sentences was easier than waiting for them to be said. She stood very straight. Then we need to call the farmers together now. Not in 3 weeks. Now. Wade looked at her. What are you planning? I'm planning to stop reacting, she said. I've been building a defense this whole time. Evidence, records, testimony. All of it defensive. Waiting for the right moment to present it to the right authority. She met his eyes. Bell just told us there isn't going to be a right moment, so we make our own. How? We invite him to it. She watched Wade was very still. A breakfast, Rosalie said. At your ranch. We tell him we've decided to accept his terms, all of us. The farmers, the dairy operators. We say we want to sign his contracts together in one meeting, make it official. She kept her voice completely even. He'll come. Men like Bell always come when they think they've won. And when he gets there, Wade said slowly, we don't have contracts. We have evidence. She pulled the folded copy of her calculation sheet from her coat pocket. In front of every farmer in the valley, with your freight record testimony, with Margaret Hale's documentation, with my father's ledgers. In public on the record before Bell has any idea it's coming. The wind moved through the pasture grass. Somewhere down the valley, a hawk was calling. Wade looked at the calculation sheet in her hand for a long moment. He won't come alone, he said. He'll bring someone. A lawyer maybe. A witness of his own. Rosalie said. The more people in the room, the harder it is to make what happens next disappear. Wade was quiet again. Then he said very carefully, if this goes wrong, if Bell realizes before we're ready, if he has time to send for help, I know. She did know. She had counted the ways it could go wrong several times over. She had counted them and decided that the ways it could go right were worth the risk. In a way they hadn't been a month ago before she'd had the freight records and the farmers and the man standing in front of her with sawdust on his sleeve. "I'll write to the inspector directly," Wade said. "Tell him to come 2 weeks earlier. If he can be in Red Bluff before the breakfast." "Can he?" "I don't know. I'll write today and ask plainly. He's a straight man. If I tell him there's time pressure, he'll understand without needing every detail." "Write it in a different hand," Rosalie said, "and give it to Mrs. Patterson to send with her mail. Bell won't have flagged her postal account." Something moved in Wade's face, a flash of something that might have been admiration, and might have been something else present and then controlled before she could examine it fully. "All right," he said. "I'll go tonight." They stood together in the pasture for a moment, the plan laid out between them like a map they'd just finished drawing, and were about to start following. Rosalie was aware of how close they were, standing closer than they usually did, because the conversation had pulled them together by degrees as the urgency had grown and neither of them had moved back. She started to step away. Wade said quietly, "Rosalie." She stopped. "If this works." He stopped himself, started again. "When this works, I want you to know that the thing I said on the first Thursday, about getting to know you better." He was choosing his words with the same care she used on her calculations, precisely without waste. "That's not contingent on any of this. It's not payment for cooperation or gratitude for the plan. It's separate." Rosalie looked at him steadily. Her chest was doing the thing it did, sometimes the thing she had placed in the careful internal drawer and not examined. She made a decision. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." "Okay," he said, quietly, like it mattered. "Okay," she said back. She walked back to the dairy. She had a letter to write, a meeting to arrange, and a trap to build out of the only materials she had. Truth numbers and the testimony of people who had been patient long enough. Agnes was still in the kitchen when she came through the door. She looked up at Rosalie's face with those eyes that saw everything, whether they were fully working or not. "Well," Agnes said. "We're going to hold a breakfast at the Callahan Ranch," Rosalie said, "and we're going to invite Horace Bell." Agnes considered this. When 10 days. That's fast. It has to be. Rosalie sat down and pulled paper toward her. "I need you to look at something, Agnes. Father's ledgers, the earliest entries, the ones from 7 and 8 years ago. I need to know if there are any patterns from before Bell bought the creamery, before we assumed this started." Agnes was already moving toward the shelf where the ledgers were kept. She moved through the kitchen with the assurance of a woman who had mapped every inch of her world by memory and did not need her eyes to navigate it. She pulled down the 2 oldest volumes and brought them to the table. She sat down across from Rosalie and opened the first one, running her fingers along the columns with the lightness of someone reading Braille. "What am I looking for?" Agnes said. "Any account named Bell," Rosalie said. "Or any account that Bell might have been operating under a different name before he bought the creamery officially." Agnes's fingers paused on a page. "Thomas noted something here," she said. "In the margin. It's small. He wrote it in pencil." She tilted the page and read carefully, her face very close to the paper. He wrote, "Check weights against Holden Creamery discrepancy noted 3rd consecutive month." Rosalie set her pen down. "Holden Creamery," she said. "Holden was the previous owner, before Bell." "Before Bell officially purchased the operation," Agnes said. She looked up. "But if Bell was already involved in the business before the official sale, if he was directing operations through Holden, then the fraud didn't start when Bell bought the creamery," Rosalie said. Her voice was very quiet. "It started before, maybe years before." She stared at the page. "Which means this isn't opportunism. This is a plan that Bell has been running for a decade." Agnes set the ledger down very carefully. "Your father noticed," she said. "And wrote it in pencil in the margin," Rosalie said, "because he wasn't certain enough to say it out loud." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "He was being careful. He was gathering evidence the same way I am, and then he—" She stopped. "Died." Agnes said gently and directly, the way she always handled the hard words. Died, Rosalie agreed. They sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was very quiet. He would have found it eventually, Agnes said, if he'd had more time. We have the time he didn't, Rosalie said. She pulled the ledger toward her and read her father's pencil note again. The small, careful handwriting of a man who was thorough and patient and had not quite gotten to where he was going. She picked up her pen. The letter to the Territorial Land Office was 3 pages long when she finished it. She documented everything: the discrepancies, the calculations, the pattern from Bell's operation, predating his official ownership, the scale fraud, the freight manifests, the names of every farmer with corroborating records. She signed it with her full name and her father's name and the date. She sealed it and wrote Margaret Hale's name on the outside of the envelope. Margaret Hale would carry it to her cousin in the next county, who would mail it from outside Horace Bell's reach. The next morning, Rosalie drove the route as she always did. Same time, same pace, same stops, same small conversations about weather and produce prices and the quality of the summer grass. She bought nothing she didn't need. She said nothing she didn't mean. She smiled at the right moments and was efficient and professional, and exactly what Bell's remaining watchers would expect to see. Then she drove to the Callahan Ranch and sat across from Wade at the work table, and they worked through the entire breakfast plan, detail by detail, for 2 hours. He had written to the inspector. He had used Mrs. Patterson's postal account. He had been careful. He wrote back already, Wade said, and passed her a note. She read it. The inspector could be in Red Bluff within the week on the condition that Wade's account of the situation was accurate and that a formal complaint was already on file with the Territorial Office. I filed the complaint yesterday, Rosalie said. Then we have our inspector. Wade looked at her across the table. 8 days, Rosalie. Can we be ready in 8 days? She thought about Margaret Hale's strongbox, Tom Garrett's receipts, her father's ledgers with the pencil note in the margin, the letter already traveling through Margaret's cousin's hands toward the territorial capital. She thought about Bell's face when he walked into Callahan Ranch expecting surrender and found something else entirely. Yes, she said. We can be ready. Wade nodded. And then, because the plan was as solid as they could make it, and because the next 8 days were going to require everything both of them had, he poured 2 cups of coffee and pushed one across to her. The biscuits were already in the oven. She could smell them from the work table. She could smell that they were right. Neither of them said anything about that. They didn't need to. They sat with the plan between them and the coffee in their hands. And outside the window, the valley held everything. It had always held the hills, the creek, the sky, waiting to see what happened next. The 8 days moved the way. Days do, when every hour has a task inside it, fast and slow, at the same time compressed in the remembering and stretched out in the living. Rosalie drove her route every morning exactly as she always had. She smiled at the right moments. She collected her 30 cents from Mrs. Patterson. She exchanged pleasantries with the Henricks family about the quality of the summer grass. She gave Bell's remaining watchers, and she was certain there were still watchers, even without the man on the ridge. Absolutely nothing to see, except a dairymaid running her ordinary route in her ordinary way. What she did not show them was Agnes working by lamplight every evening with the oldest ledgers, her fingers tracing columns, her voice reading numbers quietly into the kitchen air, while Rosalie wrote them into a clean summary document. What she did not show them was Tom Garrett arriving at the dairy on the Wednesday before the breakfast with his receipt box under his arm, and a look on his face like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was finally about to set it down. What she did not show them was Margaret Hale, who came the following day with a leather folder so precisely organized that Rosalie felt a surge of affection so strong it caught her off guard. Every receipt dated, every weight discrepancy, highlighted in her late husband's red ink, every notation in Margaret's own firm handwriting. He always kept red ink in his desk, Margaret said when she saw Rosalie looking at it. I never used it while he was alive because it seemed like his. I used it for this. Rosalie looked at her. Good, she said. That's exactly right. Wade had sent invitations to Bell through a channel that required careful construction. Not a letter from Wade himself that would signal something was different. Instead, he asked Pete Garfield, who owned the Red Bluff hardware store and had no connection to the dairy business or the cooperative plans, to mention casually to Bell's office manager that there was talk of a meeting at Callahan Ranch where the Valley's independent operators were going to discuss accepting Bell's terms collectively. That they'd found it easier to agree to sign together than one at a time. That Wade Callahan had offered his kitchen as a neutral space. It was the truth arranged to sound like defeat. Rosalie had constructed it carefully, the same way she'd constructed her father's ledger summary. Every word chosen for the impression it would create in a specific mind. Bell's office manager sent a reply within 48 hours. Mr. Bell would be pleased to attend. He would bring his contracts and a notary. He expected the meeting to be productive. Rosalie read the reply standing at Wade's work table and felt something cold and clarifying move through her chest. "He's bringing a notary," she said. "He wants the signatures the same day." Wade's voice was steady. "He's not going to give anyone time to change their mind. He thinks we've already changed our minds." She set the letter down. "Good. Let him think that right up until he walks through your door." The circuit inspector arrived in Red Bluff 6 days before the breakfast, which was 1 day earlier than he'd promised, and which told Rosalie something important about the kind of man he was. His name was Arthur Crane, and he was 51 years old, angular with a way of speaking that was entirely precise and entirely without drama. Wade had brought him to the dairy on his second day in the county, and Rosalie had sat across the kitchen table from him for an hour and presented everything she had. Crane looked at the documents without expression. He asked 11 questions, each one specific, none of them redundant. He wrote nothing down during the presentation, which told her his memory was either excellent or trained, and when she'd finished, he sat in silence for approximately 45 seconds. "Your discrepancy calculations," he said. "You cross-referenced these against what standard?" "My father's original weight records, which predate Bell's involvement with the creamery," Rosalie said. "And against independently measured samples, I took myself over the past month using the county-certified scale at the Red Bluff grain office." "You used the grain office scale?" "On 6 separate occasions. I have the measurement logs signed by the grain office clerk each time." Crane looked at her, then he looked at Wade. "Mr. Callahan, your testimony about the internal ledger figures you observed. I can reproduce the numbers I saw," Wade said. "All of them. From memory." "Yes. You're prepared to swear to this before a territorial officer?" "I am." Crane wrote something small and precise in the corner of his notebook. "I will inspect Bell's receiving scales tomorrow morning. I will conduct it as a routine district review. He has no grounds to refuse, and refusal itself would constitute a finding." He looked at Rosalie again. "Your formal complaint to the territorial office, it's been received and logged." "I sent confirmation of receipt 3 days ago," Rosalie said. "The case number is written on the top of that first page." Crane looked at the page. He looked at the case number. He looked at Rosalie once more. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I have been conducting inspections in this territory for 14 years. I want you to understand something clearly." He tapped the stack of documents with one finger. "This is the most complete preliminary evidence package I have seen from a private citizen in 14 years of this work." Rosalie did not allow herself to feel that entirely until he had left the room. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat on the surface and breathed. Wade appeared beside her. He didn't say anything. He put a cup of coffee next to her hands and stepped back. She picked it up. 14 years, she said. 14 years, he agreed. She drank the coffee. Her hands were perfectly steady, which she considered a significant personal achievement given the circumstances. 2 days, she said. The breakfast is in 2 days. 2 days, Wade said. And Crane will have the scale inspection done before Bell walks through the door. The scale inspection happened the next morning. Crane arrived at Bell's creamery as part of his stated routine review of the district. Bell was not present. He was in his office in town, but his operations manager, a man named Tolliver, was. Crane tested Bell's receiving scale against his certified standard weights. He tested it 4 times. Bell's scale read consistently light. Not by accident. Not by the drift that happens in old equipment with worn mechanisms. It read light by a precisely consistent margin that Crane would later describe in his report as requiring deliberate calibration, the kind of adjustment that could not occur through ordinary use and could only be produced by someone who understood how the scale functioned and had intentionally modified it. Crane did not share this finding immediately. He thanked Tolliver, made his notes, and drove directly to the Bennett dairy, where he found Rosalie and Wade and Agnes all at the kitchen table with the final evidence summary spread between them. He sat down without preamble. Bell's scale is reading 11% light on a consistent basis, he said. Against a certified 200-pound standard, it reads 178 pounds. The number landed in the kitchen like a stone. Agnes was the first to speak. 11%, she said quietly. On every delivery, every farmer, every month. For however long the scale has been modified, Crane said. Rosalie was already running the calculation in her head, the same calculation she'd done a dozen times, but now with a precise certified number instead of an estimate. 11% across all Valley dairy deliveries for the period she could document. Across 4 dairy operations over 18 months. The number was not $8.40. The number was considerably larger, and it didn't include the farmers who had already sold out to Bell and couldn't testify to what they'd lost. He'll argue the scale wore down naturally, Wade said. He can argue whatever he likes, Crane said. The calibration marks inside the mechanism tell a different story. Someone used a tool on that scale. It was not a gradual process. Rosalie put her pen down and looked at Crane directly. Can you testify to that tomorrow? I can testify to my inspection findings. Crane met her eyes. I will testify to my inspection findings. That is precisely what my office exists to do. Agnes made a sound from across the table, quiet, controlled, entirely composed, and Rosalie recognized it as the sound her aunt made when she was not going to cry in front of other people and was working very hard at it. Agnes, Rosalie said softly. Don't mind me, Agnes said in the brisk voice of a woman who minds very much. I'm simply considering what your father would have said to hear this number. No one in the kitchen spoke for a moment. Then Wade said, he'd have said it was about time. Agnes looked toward his voice, and whatever she saw in his direction made her nod once slowly, with the particular gravity of someone granting something significant. The morning of the breakfast, Rosalie was at Callahan Ranch before 6. Not because there was work to do that couldn't wait. There was plenty, but that wasn't why she came early. She came because she needed to be in the space before it filled up with other people and other things, and she was not ready to examine why that was so. She simply did it. Wade was already in the kitchen. The long table had been set up. Wade had borrowed 2 additional tables from neighboring properties to extend it into the main room. Coffee was on. There were biscuits in the oven, and the smell was right. He looked up when she came through the door. You slept, he said. 4 hours, she said. About that. He poured her coffee. Crane is coming at 8, farmers at 8:30. I sent the final word to Bell's office yesterday. The meeting is at 9. Who confirmed? Bell himself. He wrote back personally. Wade passed her the cup. He's bringing his lawyer. His lawyer is better than a notary, Rosalie said. A lawyer means he's taking this seriously. It means he thinks this is a significant acquisition. It also means if things go wrong, they won't, she said, not because she was certain, because she needed to say it and mean it enough to carry through the next 3 hours. Wade looked at her. He had that expression, the careful one, the one she had spent months learning the edges of. You're ready, he said. It was not a question. I've been ready since I sat down with my father's ledgers the first time, she said. I just didn't have everything I needed. He nodded. You have it now. The farmers began arriving at 8:30. Tom Garrett came first with his wife, for the first time a woman named Ruth, who Rosalie had met only briefly, but who shook her hand when she came through the door with a grip that said everything her silence didn't. Margaret Hale arrived in her good dress, which struck Rosalie as exactly right. She had dressed for something that mattered, and it did. The Collier family, husband and wife, both came together. A fourth farmer, Henry Bauer, whom Rosalie had only brought into the plan 4 days earlier because she hadn't trusted the timeline to hold, came in last and looked around the room with the expression of a man who is doing something frightening and has decided that frightening is not a reason not to do it. Arthur Crane sat at one end of the long table with his official inspection documents in front of him, his posture that of a man entirely unimpressed by drama but entirely committed to accuracy. Rosalie stood at the head of the room and looked at all of them. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I want to be clear about what today is. This is not a confrontation. This is a presentation of evidence in the presence of witnesses in front of a man who has been taking money from every person in this room for years." She looked around the table. "When Bell arrives, let him speak. Let him believe what he came here expecting. I will tell him when it's time to understand that he was wrong." No one argued. No one looked uncertain. Tom Garrett's wife Ruth was looking at her with an expression that Rosalie had to look away from, because it was too direct and too much for the moment. She looked at Wade instead. He was standing near the door with his arms crossed, and when her eyes found his, he simply nodded. Once the short, certain nod she had come to understand meant, "I'm here, I'm ready, nothing has changed." She nodded back. Bell arrived at 9:15, which was 15 minutes late, which she recognized immediately as a deliberate choice. Men like Bell were never accidentally late. He was making a point about whose time mattered more. He came in with two people, his lawyer, a thin man named Carver, and a third man. Rosalie didn't recognize who turned out when he introduced himself to be the freight manager from the railroad depot. The freight manager from the railroad depot. Rosalie kept her face completely neutral while her mind moved very fast. Bell had brought the one person whose record she had been trying to cross-reference for weeks. Either Bell was incredibly confident or incredibly careless, and she was no longer certain which applied. "Miss Bennett," Bell said, walking in and looking around the room with the pleasant, practiced expression of a man counting pieces on a board. "Mr. Callahan, I'm glad we could arrange this. It's always better when neighbors can sit down together." "Sit down," Rosalie said, and gestured to the empty side of the table. Bell sat. His lawyer sat beside him. The freight manager sat at the end, looking mildly uncomfortable, which told Rosalie he had not been fully briefed on what he was walking into. "Good. I understand you've all had time to reconsider my proposals," Bell said. He opened his leather case with the ease of a man who has done this before and always walked out satisfied. "I think you'll find the contracts fair. More than fair given the current market." "Mr. Bell," Rosalie said. He looked at her. He was still smiling, but something in his expression recalibrated slightly at the tone of her voice. "Before we discuss any contracts," she said, "I'd like to show you something." She placed her father's ledger on the table in front of him. Bell looked at it. He looked at the cover, which bore her father's name in ink that had faded from black to brown over 15 years. His expression did not change immediately, but she was watching for the small things. The slight stillness around his eyes, the way his hands paused for half a second before settling flat on the tabletop. He had seen this ledger before. She was suddenly completely certain of it. He recognized it. "Your father's records," Bell said pleasantly. "I didn't know Thomas kept such detailed journals." "He kept very detailed journals," Rosalie said, "including entries noting discrepancies between his delivery records and the payments he received from the Holden Creamery." She watched Bell's face. "The business you were directing through Mr. Holden before you purchased it officially." The room was very quiet. Bell's pleasant expression did not collapse. It did something more subtle and more telling. It became more deliberate, more constructed. The naturalness went out of it and was replaced with something that was wearing the shape of naturalness, like a coat put on quickly before answering the door. "I'm not sure what you mean by directing," Bell said. "I had a business arrangement with Holden, yes. Standard industry practice." "A business arrangement that involved his receiving scale," Rosalie said. "The same type of scale calibration you later implemented at your own creamery." She looked at Arthur Crane. Crane opened his folder. "My name is Arthur Crane," he said to Bell, and to Bell's lawyer with equal directness. "I am the district circuit inspector for weights and measures. Yesterday morning I conducted a routine inspection of the Bell Creamery's receiving scale. He placed his inspection report on the table and slid it toward Bell's lawyer. The scale is reading 11% below accurate weight on a consistent basis. The internal calibration marks indicate deliberate modification. Bell's lawyer picked up the report. He read it. His expression did not give much away, but his stillness gave a great deal. "That's a significant accusation," Bell's lawyer said. "It is an inspection finding," Crane said. "The distinction matters." "Mr. Bell," Rosalie said, "I'd also like you to look at this." She placed the receipt comparison document on the table. Her compilation of every receipt from every farmer at the table, compared against the certified weight measurements she had taken herself. This represents 18 months of documented discrepancies between what your creamery told these farmers they had delivered and what they actually delivered according to certified measurement. The total across the 4 operations represented in this room is... She read the number. Someone in the room made a sound. She didn't look to see who. She kept her eyes on Bell. The pleasant expression was gone now. What was underneath it was careful and cold and calculating, and she found with a certainty she hadn't expected that she was not afraid of it. "I don't know where these figures come from," Bell said. "Scales vary, measurement conditions vary. Any experienced dairy operator knows that. These figures come from the county grain office scale," Rosalie said, "measured 6 times with signed witness logs." She placed those on the table as well. "And from Mr. Callahan's direct observation of your internal freight ledgers, which show incoming milk volumes, inconsistent with your outgoing production records by approximately 800 pounds over a 4-month period." Bell's eyes moved to Wade for the first time. Something in that look was not pleasant. "You let him into my office," Bell said. "You invited me," Wade said from his position near the door. His voice was entirely even. "You left me alone in the room. I have a good memory." "This is..." Bell started. "Mr. Bell." The voice that spoke was not Rosalie's. It was the freight manager's. Everyone looked at him. He was a middle-aged man, with the specific look of someone who has just understood something he didn't want to understand, and has decided that the truth is less dangerous than the alternative. "I brought documentation from the depot," he said to Bell. "You told me you wanted it for the contract meeting, to show current freight volume." He opened his own folder slowly, like a man not entirely sure he wanted to do what he was doing. "These are the manifest records from the past year. What Bell's Creamery shipped through the Red Bluff Depot." He placed them on the table. Rosalie looked at the manifest totals. She looked at the intake figures Bell had paid the farmers for. She did the calculation in her head in approximately 8 seconds. She looked up at Bell. "You shipped more product than you received," she said quietly. "According to your own shipping records and your own payment receipts, you processed 430 pounds of cream that you never officially received from your suppliers." The room was completely silent. Bell said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then he stood up. Later, Rosalie would understand that she should have anticipated what came next. That a man who had spent a decade building a careful fraud would not simply sit at a table and accept the unraveling of it. That the precise controlled exterior would crack under exactly this kind of pressure, in exactly this kind of room, in front of exactly this many witnesses. Bell's elbow hit the lamp on the side table as he stood. Whether it was deliberate or not was something people would argue about afterward. Rosalie was never certain. What she was certain of was the immediate result. The lamp tipped the oil spread and the dry tablecloth at the end of the side table caught in the space of a breath. The room went from silence to chaos in a single second. Margaret Hale grabbed the ledgers nearest to her before anyone told her to. Ruth Garrett pulled her husband back from the table. Someone shouted. The fire was small, a tablecloth, a narrow margin, but small fires in dry wood buildings had their own intentions. Wade crossed the room in 3 strides and got a blanket off the chair by the wall. He beat the flame down in 4 hard motions, the kind of focused immediate action that left no room for hesitation. The fire went out. The tablecloth was ruined. The room smelled of smoke and hot lamp oil, but everything that mattered was intact. Rosalie had not moved from her position at the head of the table. She had watched Wade handle the fire, and she had felt the specific terrible helplessness of watching someone she cared about move into something dangerous, and she had held her ground because Bell was moving toward the door and Tom Garrett was already there, and the farmers had understood the instruction she'd given before the meeting without her needing to repeat it. Nobody is leaving until the marshal arrives. Bell stopped at the door. Garrett was not a physically imposing man, but he was standing in the doorway with the particular immovability of someone who has been waiting a long time for this specific moment. "Tom," Bell said. The pleasant voice was entirely gone. "This is not what you want." "No," Garrett said. "What I wanted was my son to go to school in Cheyenne. That didn't happen." He did not move. "The marshal's been sent for." Bell looked around the room. His lawyer was standing very still, reading the inspection report again, with the expression of a man who has realized he is on the wrong side of something he cannot undo. The freight manager was sitting at the table, looking at his own documents as though he was seeing them for the first time. Wade was still holding the scorched blanket. His left arm had a burn along the forearm, not deep, but visible the sleeve of his shirt, dark and damaged. He was watching Bell with an expression that was not anger. It was something quieter and more absolute. Rosalie looked at Wade's arm. She looked at his face. He met her eyes across the room and said without speaking that he was all right. She did not believe him entirely about the arm, but she believed him about everything else. She looked back at Bell. "Sit down, Mr. Bell," she said. He didn't sit, but he didn't move toward the door again either. The marshal arrived 40 minutes later. 40 minutes that Rosalie spent standing at the head of that table with the evidence in front of her, and Bell's lawyer, quietly reviewing every document she'd provided, and Bell himself, sitting in a chair he'd eventually taken, with the look of a man watching something he'd built for a decade come apart piece by piece. His lawyer spoke to him quietly twice. Both times Bell said something short and clipped. Both times his lawyer's expression got a fraction more controlled and a fraction more final. When the marshal came through the door, a tall man named Grady, who had been marshal in Red Bluff for 8 years, and who walked into difficult rooms with the easy authority of someone who had seen most varieties of human calculation and was rarely surprised. He looked at the assembled room, at the documents on the table, at the scorched tablecloth in the corner, at Bell, sitting in the chair, and at Rosalie standing at the head of the table. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Marshal Grady," she said. "Thank you for coming. Arthur Crane sent word yesterday that I might be needed." He looked at Crane. "Your inspection." "Complete," Crane said. "My report is on the table." Grady picked it up. He read it with the efficiency of a man who read official documents regularly and knew how to find the significant lines. He set it down. He looked at Bell. "Mr. Bell," he said, "I'm going to ask you to come with me." "This is a misunderstanding," Bell said. But the voice had changed entirely. The pleasantness was gone, the coldness was gone, and what was left was something that Rosalie recognized with a detached clarity as fear dressed up as dignity. "That's possible," Grady said in the tone of a man for whom it was not possible. "You can explain it to the territorial judge." He looked at Bell's lawyer. "I assume you'll be accompanying your client." Bell's lawyer gathered his papers without answering, which was itself an answer. Bell was escorted out. The room held its collective breath until the sound of hoofbeats faded down the Callahan road. Then Tom Garrett let out a long breath and sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "Lord Almighty," he said. His wife Ruth put her hand on his shoulder. Margaret Hale sat down too. She was holding her leather folder against her chest, both arms wrapped around it, and her eyes were very bright. "It's done," she said, to Rosalie. Specifically to Rosalie. "The arrest is done," Rosalie said. "There's still the case. The territorial court, the hearing the evidence formally submitted." She looked around the room. "This isn't finished, but the part where he gets to keep doing it, that part is finished." Silence. Then Henry Bauer, who had said almost nothing the entire morning, who had come to this meeting 4 days after being asked because he was frightened and had come anyway, said quietly, "My wife is going to want to know how this happened. She's not going to believe me when I tell her." "Tell her," Rosalie said. "Tell her exactly what happened. Tell every person you know exactly what happened." She looked around the table at Garrett and Ruth, at Margaret, at the Colliers, at Bauer. The best protection any of us have now is that everybody knows. That was when she finally let herself look at Wade. He was sitting in the chair by the wall. She hadn't seen him sit down. He'd done it quietly while the marshal was present, and he had the scorched blanket folded across his lap and his left arm held slightly away from his body in the particular careful way of someone managing pain they are not interested in mentioning. She crossed the room. She sat in the chair next to him, which she pulled close enough that she could see the arm clearly. "Let me look at it," she said. "It's fine," he said. "I didn't ask if it was fine." She held out her hand. After a moment, he offered his arm. The burn was across the forearm 3 inches not deep, the skin raised and red but intact. She'd seen worse on dairy work. She'd treated worse. "I have salve at the dairy," she said, "and clean cloth." She didn't release his arm. "Why didn't you wait for someone else to?" "Because it needed doing right then," he said. "You could have waited 2 seconds. 2 seconds is sometimes too long." She looked up at him. He was looking back at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had been filing in the careful internal drawer for months. The drawer was full. There was no room left. She could feel the pressure of it from the inside. "You scared me," she said. It was not the kind of thing she said easily. She said it anyway because it was true. Wade was very still. "I'm sorry," he said. And he meant it. She could hear that he meant it not as a reflex, but as something considered and real. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just don't do it again without telling me first." Something in his face shifted. "You want me to narrate while I'm putting out a fire. I want you to—" She stopped. She was still holding his arm. She was aware suddenly of exactly how close they were sitting and how naturally she had placed herself there. "I want to know that you're all right before someone else needs me to be somewhere." The kitchen around them was filled with the low conversation of tired, relieved people. No one was paying attention to the two of them in the corner. Or perhaps they were, and were being polite about it, which was likely in a small valley. "I'm all right," Wade said. "Rosalie." She looked at him. "We did it," he said, quietly, "just for her." She looked at the room. She looked at Tom Garrett, talking to the marshal's deputy, who had stayed behind to take statements. The weight in his shoulders, different now, not gone, not fixed, but different. She looked at Margaret Hale with her leather folder finally open on the table in front of her, walking the deputy through each entry with the precision of a woman who had waited 2 years to speak and was not going to waste a word. She looked at the scorched tablecloth in the corner and the documents in the center of the table, and the window that looked out over the creek that Bell had wanted and had not gotten. "We did it," she said. It was not finished. She had said that herself and meant it. The case, the court, the formal proceedings, the recovery. All of that still lay ahead, and she was not a woman who confused winning a battle with ending a war. But this part, this specific, necessary, long overdue part, was done. She became aware that she had not released his arm. She became aware that he had not moved to take it back. She did not release it. Outside, the valley held steady in the late morning. The hills, the creek, the ordinary summer sky. The dairy route waited. The ledgers waited. The cooperative that was not yet a cooperative, but would be waited. All of it waited. Right now, in this specific kitchen, at this specific moment, Rosalie Bennett sat beside Wade Callahan, with his burned arm in her hands, and let herself feel for just a little while the weight of everything they had carried and put down. It was heavier than she'd expected. It was lighter, too. The territorial court hearing was set for 6 weeks after Bell's arrest, which was 6 weeks that moved nothing like the 8 days before the breakfast had moved. Those 8 days had been compressed by purpose and urgency into something that felt manageable. These 6 weeks spread out differently, wider, less certain, filled with the particular anxiety of waiting for something important that you could no longer control through preparation alone. Rosalie prepared anyway. It was what she knew how to do. She worked with the territorial attorney, a methodical man from Cheyenne named Aldous Webb, who wore the same brown coat to every meeting and asked questions with the patience of someone who had learned that rushing a witness produced worse testimony than waiting. She sat across from him 4 times in 6 weeks, each time going through the evidence in the order. He determined answering his questions exactly as asked and not beyond. He told her after the third meeting that she was the clearest witness he had prepared in 11 years of territorial practice. "I've had years of practice explaining numbers to people who didn't want to believe them," she said. Webb almost smiled. "That preparation shows." The dairy kept running. It had to. The land payment was now behind her, the expanded route, the new accounts Wade had quietly built for her through his ranch connections, and a bridge loan from the Farmers Cooperative Fund that Garrett had proposed, and everyone had voted for, within 48 hours of Bell's arrest, had covered the $42 with 11 days to spare. She had repaid $8 of it already. She would repay the rest before winter. She did not think about the bridge loan as charity. She thought about it the way she thought about the fence post Wade had mended while waiting for her in the front pasture, as the kind of help that was offered between people who were working toward the same thing, and understood that everyone needed a hand over a rough patch, sometimes provided the hand did not stay longer than the rough patch lasted. The cooperative was taking shape in ways that were messier and slower and more argumentative than she had imagined, which she had been told by everyone who knew anything about cooperatives was exactly correct and meant it was real. They had 4 members formally committed: Garrett Hale, the Colliers Bauer, and 2 more families who were considering. They had an arrangement with Wade for use of his barn at a documented fair market lease rate, written in clear language with no clauses about renegotiation. They had the creek crossing secured, which meant the route to the railroad depot was theirs to use without asking Bell's permission. They did not yet have the railroad supply contract. That negotiation was ongoing, conducted across 3 letters and 2 in-person meetings with the regional freight agent, a precise woman named Clara Simmons, who had been doing this job for 9 years, and who looked at Rosalie's pricing proposal, her quality documentation, and her transparency structure, and said, "I've been waiting for someone to bring me something like this for a long time." "So have I," Rosalie said. They were still negotiating the volume terms when the court date arrived. The hearing lasted 2 days. Rosalie had expected it to feel like a culmination, the moment everything built toward loud and significant, the way important moments were supposed to feel. Instead, it felt precise and procedural and slightly exhausting, which Webb had warned her it would be. Bell's lawyer was competent. He argued calibration drift on the scale. He argued misinterpretation of the freight records. He argued that Wade Callahan's memory testimony was unreliable as a matter of principle, that no man could reproduce ledger figures accurately from a 4-minute observation without taking notes. Wade testified for 45 minutes. He reproduced the figures he had seen in Bell's office without hesitation, in order with the column headings and the date ranges and the specific formatting of the entries. When Bell's lawyer challenged him on the accuracy of memory, Wade said simply and entirely without drama, "I spent 11 years running cattle drives where the difference between a correct head count and a wrong one was the difference between a profitable run and a ruined one. I learned to remember numbers correctly. It was part of the job." The territorial judge, a 63-year-old man named Harlan Price, who had been hearing cases in this territory for 22 years, and who had the particular expression of someone who has seen every variety of human dishonesty and is tired of most of them, looked at Bell's lawyer after Wade's testimony and said, "Do you have anything further on the memory question?" Bell's lawyer said he did not. Rosalie testified on the afternoon of the first day. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap and her father's ledger summary on the table in front of her, and answered every question Webb asked her in the order he asked them. When Bell's lawyer cross-examined her and suggested that her discrepancy calculations might reflect her own inexperience with commercial dairy accounting, she looked at him directly and said, "My calculations were verified by the district circuit inspector, cross-referenced against certified county scale measurements, taken 6 times with signed witness logs, and corroborated by 3 separate farmers' independent records. If you would like to identify the specific figure you believe to be in error, I'll walk you through the methodology." Bell's lawyer did not identify a specific figure. Arthur Crane testified with the weight and precision of 14 years of official inspection work behind every word he said. Margaret Hale testified in her good dress again, this time in the formal witness chair, with her leather folder open in front of her, and her voice entirely steady. Tom Garrett testified, and when he mentioned his son, who should have gone to school in Cheyenne, The courtroom was very quiet for a moment after he finished speaking. The freight manager from the railroad depot, whose name was Morris, whom Bell had brought to the breakfast without fully explaining why, turned out to be the most significant witness of all, because he had brought his depot manifests to that breakfast in good faith, and because Bell's lawyer could not explain to the court why his client's shipping records showed more product going out than his own payment records showed coming in. Morris had spent 2 weeks after Bell's arrest reviewing every manifest for the past 3 years. He testified for an hour and a half. He was calm and thorough and deeply unhappy about all of it in the specific way of a man who takes professional record-keeping seriously and has just discovered that his records have been used as part of a fraud. The verdict came on the second day's afternoon. Bell was found guilty on 4 counts of commercial fraud, 2 counts of falsifying official business records, and 1 count of interference with legitimate commerce. His creamery assets were ordered frozen pending restitution calculations. His attorney immediately filed notice of appeal, which Webb had told Rosalie was certain to happen. "Does the appeal change anything?" she asked him outside the courtroom. "It delays the asset disposition," Webb said. "But the conviction stands during appeal unless overturned, which given the evidence I consider unlikely. And the scale modification evidence alone is sufficient to sustain the fraud charges regardless of the memory testimony question." "How long is the appeal process?" "Months, possibly longer." She absorbed this. The conviction was not an ending then. It was a different kind of beginning. The beginning of the long administrative aftermath of justice, which moved at its own pace and did not particularly care about the timing preferences of the people who had worked to achieve it. "All right," she said. "What do I need to do?" Webb almost smiled again. It was becoming a pattern. What she needed to do, it turned out, was a great deal depositions asset inventory, participation, documentation review, coordination with the territorial attorney's office on the restitution calculations for each affected farmer. She did all of it. She did it on top of the morning route, the cooperative meetings, the railroad contract negotiations, and the ongoing work of running a dairy through the transition from summer to fall. She was tired in a way she hadn't been before, not the survival tired of the past 3 years, the grinding exhaustion of a person doing everything alone on an insufficient margin. This was different. This was the tiredness of someone who had used more of herself than she'd known she had, and had found to her own surprise that there was more to use. Agnes noticed. Agnes always noticed. "You need a Sunday," Agnes said on a Thursday evening when Rosalie had been at the kitchen table with cooperative documents for 2 hours after finishing the dairy work. "I don't have Sundays." "You need to take one anyway." Agnes moved the nearest stack of papers 6 inches to the left, which was the Agnes Bennett version of emphasis. "You're running well. That means now is exactly when you should stop before you run yourself past the point where stopping is easy." Rosalie looked at her aunt. Agnes was sitting across the table with her hands folded, her face in the lamp's circle of light. Her eyes still limited, still managing, still seeing more than they should have been able to, directed at approximately the right place. "Wade asked me to come to dinner Saturday," Rosalie said. She had not mentioned this yet. She had been not mentioning it for 4 days, with the specific discipline of a woman who did not trust herself to discuss it calmly. Agnes said nothing. The nothing was very loud. "It's not," Rosalie started. "I didn't say anything," Agnes said. "You were about to." "I was going to observe that dinner is a reasonable meal between people who have been through what you two have been through, and that the question of whether it means something is less important than whether you want to go." Agnes paused. "Do you want to go?" Rosalie looked at the papers in front of her. The cooperative bylaws draft, the railroad contract terms summary, the restitution figure estimate for the Bennett dairy that Webb's office had sent last week, which was larger than she'd calculated and which she still hadn't fully processed. "Yes," she said. "Then go," Agnes said, "and come home and tell me how the biscuits were." She went on Saturday. The kitchen at Callahan Ranch smelled the way it had from the very beginning. Wood smoke and coffee, and something warm and certain. But it was different now, in the way that familiar places become different when enough time has passed and enough has happened in them. The long table was just a kitchen table again, not a courtroom and not a trap. The chair she sat in was just a chair. Wade had made dinner. A real one, not biscuits, not a quick breakfast, but an actual meal that had taken time and attention. He did not say how long it had taken. She did not ask. The asking and the answering were both beside the point. They ate and talked the way they had been talking for months, directly, practically, honestly, the way two people talk when they have been through something together that required them to be exactly who they were without embellishment. The cooperative. The railroad contract, which she'd received final terms on that Friday, and which she was going to sign on Monday. The restitution process. The appeal. Then the conversation moved somewhere else. The way conversations do when the practical topics have been handled and what's left underneath has been waiting. Tom Garrett's son is going to school in Cheyenne, Wade said. Garrett told me yesterday. The restitution estimate from Webb's office covered the tuition. Rosalie set her fork down very carefully. When? She said. Spring term. She looked at the table for a moment. She was not going to do the thing Agnes would say was unnecessary, which was apologize for the fact that her eyes were doing something she hadn't told them to do. Good, she said. Her voice was steady. That's exactly right. Yes, Wade said. It is. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically. Not with announcement. Just placed it there, warm and certain the way a man does when he has decided that the moment has arrived and he is not going to talk himself out of it. Rosalie looked at his hand on hers. She looked at the burn scar on his forearm, healed now, a thin, pale mark she had dressed and checked and thought about more than was strictly professional. She looked at his face. I've been thinking, he said, about something I want to say to you. And I've been trying to find the right time, and I've decided there isn't a right time. There's just time. Wade, she said. Let me say it, he said. I've been rehearsing it. You don't rehearse things. I rehearsed this one. He met her eyes. I came to this valley because I inherited a piece of land and needed somewhere to go that wasn't Texas. I was not planning to find anything here except a ranch that needed work and enough distance from who I'd been. He started again. I found you instead. And what I found when I found you was not what I expected, which was easier than I could have imagined, and harder than anything I've done in a long time simultaneously. She did not look away. I'm not asking you to need me, he said. You've made it clear in about 40 different ways that you don't operate that way, and I don't want you to be different. I'm asking you to want me around. The same way I want you around. Every morning. Every Thursday. Every day that isn't Thursday. The kitchen was very quiet. You're saying every day, she said. I'm saying every day, he confirmed. She turned her hand over under his and held it. The dairy stays mine, she said. The cooperative is mine. My name on every document. I would not have it any other way. And if we disagree about something, then we disagree about something and we work it out, he said. The same way we've been doing since the first Thursday. She thought about the first Thursday. She thought about walking into this kitchen because his biscuits were burning and she couldn't drive past a preventable problem. She thought about what she'd thought then, that she was being practical, managing a situation, maintaining appropriate professional distance. She had been wrong about all of it. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, to which part? All of it, she said. Every day, every morning, your kitchen and mine and the road in between. He lifted her hand and pressed it briefly and completely to his mouth, and she felt that all the way to the place in her chest where the careful internal drawer had been, which was now entirely empty, because everything she'd stored there had moved somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't have a drawer, somewhere that was simply open. I should tell you something, he said when he'd lowered her hand, but not released it. Tell me. I wrote to the family of my friend, the one from the cattle drive in Texas. His voice was careful. I've been putting it off for years. The accident, I made a bad call. I knew the weather was turning and I pushed ahead anyway because we were behind on the drive and I didn't want to lose the time. He died because I made that call. He stopped. I wrote to his wife, his mother. I told them the truth about what happened and what my part in it was. Rosalie listened. She did not rush to fill the space. "They wrote back," he said. "Both of them." He reached into his shirt pocket with his free hand and placed 2 folded letters on the table. He did not open them. He had clearly read them enough times that he didn't need to. His wife said she'd known for years that it wasn't simple, that the weather was bad for everyone on that drive, and that her husband had made the choice to ride with me and had made it himself. She said she'd been waiting for me to be ready to hear that. Rosalie looked at the letters. "And his mother," she said. "She said she forgave me." His voice was very quiet. "She said she'd been praying that I'd come to the place where I could accept it." Rosalie did not say anything immediately. Some things required a moment of respect before words were added to them. "How do you feel?" she said finally. "Like I've been carrying a stone for 4 years and put it down," he said. "And now my arms don't know what to do." She understood that feeling. She understood it from the inside. "They'll figure it out," she said. "Give them time." He looked at her. His expression was the one she had spent months learning to read, and she knew now with complete certainty exactly what it meant. It had always meant the same thing. She had simply been careful about acknowledging it until she was sure she could hold it without dropping it. She was sure now. "Come to Texas with me," he said. "Not permanently. Just I want to visit them, his wife and mother. I want to go in person, not just by letter, and I don't want to go alone." "When?" "After the appeal is settled. After the cooperative has its railroad contract signed. After—" He paused. "After you can leave for 2 weeks without the whole valley collapsing." "That might be spring," she said. "Spring is fine," he said. "I've waited longer for less important things." They married in October, 6 weeks after the appeal was filed, and 3 weeks before it was rejected on a day that was cold and bright and perfectly ordinary, in the way that good days often are unremarkable in their machinery, irreplaceable in their meaning. The ceremony was in the yard of Callahan Ranch, because the house was not big enough for everyone who came, and everyone came. The Garretts, the Hales, the Colliers. Bauer and his wife, who turned out to be a small, precise woman who had strong opinions about everything and expressed them clearly, and whom Rosalie liked immediately. Mrs. Patterson, who had exact change for every occasion in her life, and arrived with a jar of the good cherry preserves she'd been putting up for 40 years. The Henricks family. Clara Simmons, the railroad freight agent, who sent a letter of congratulation and a formal copy of the finalized cooperative supply contract, both of which Rosalie considered equally appropriate wedding gifts. Agnes stood next to Rosalie through the ceremony, with her hand on Rosalie's arm, a grip that was light and steady, and entirely Agnes, not leaning, not guiding, simply there. Rosalie kept the Bennett dairy in her name. She kept the cooperative manager's position, which the farmers reconfirmed by vote, a month after the wedding, which she had not asked them to do, and which mattered to her more because of that. Wade retained Callahan Ranch. The creek crossing remained in his name, and in the cooperative's access agreement, documented, clearly reviewed, annually adjusted when circumstances changed. Nothing was absorbed into anything else. Nothing was traded for anything else. That had been the condition, and it held, and it was real. The cooperative signed the railroad supply contract on a Monday in November, with Clara Simmons in attendance and every cooperative member present. Rosalie signed first, then Margaret Hale, then Tom Garrett, who pressed his pen down with the particular deliberateness of a man making a permanent mark. When all the signatures were in place, Clara Simmons folded her copy of the contract and said with the understated satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for exactly this, "I look forward to doing business with people I can trust." "So do we," Rosalie said. The restitution process extended into the following spring, as Webb had predicted. When the calculations were finalized and the payments began coming from Bell's frozen assets, the amounts were smaller than they might have been because Bell's operation had been structured to shelter assets from exactly this kind of recovery. But they were real. Tom Garrett's son went to school in Cheyenne. Margaret Hale repaired the barn roof that had been letting weather in since she couldn't afford to fix it. Henry Bauer's wife bought the sewing machine she had been putting off for 3 years. Small things. Specific things. The kind of things that people need and don't get when someone has been quietly taking what's theirs. Agnes's eyes improved slightly with the treatment that had become possible when the dairy's finances stabilized, not fully, not to what they had been, but enough that she could read the ledger entries herself again on good days, which she did with the focused attention of a woman who had been kept from something she valued and was not taking it for granted. She took over the cooperative's bookkeeping formally in the spring, which she had proposed herself, and which Rosalie had accepted without argument, because Agnes was the best bookkeeper she had ever known, and the cooperative needed exactly that. "I'm not charity work," Agnes said when Rosalie started to say something about not needing to. "I know," Rosalie said. "That's why I said yes." Agnes ran the books with the same precision she had applied to everything in her life for 58 years. She found 2 arithmetic errors in the railroad invoice process within her first month and corrected them without mentioning it to anyone except Rosalie, who mentioned it to Clara Simmons, who looked at the corrections and said she would be adjusting the invoice process going forward. In the spring, Rosalie and Wade went to Texas. She had never been. The flatness of it surprised her the way Wade had said the valley's hills had surprised him. The landscape expressing something about how life worked in a place, something that took a while to read. They drove to the town where Wade's friend had lived a 2-day journey by train and then by wagon, and they arrived on a morning that was warm in the particular way of Texas spring, which had nothing in common with Wyoming spring, except that both involved relief. Wade's friend's wife was named Clara. A coincidence that made Rosalie think briefly of Clara Simmons, and then let it go. And she was 34 years old with 2 children who ran into the yard when the wagon came up the drive and looked at Wade with the particular mixture of recognition and uncertainty that children have around adults who are significant in ways they don't entirely understand. The older child, a boy of about 9, looked at Wade for a long moment and said, "You look like how Papa described you." Wade went very still. "How did he describe me?" he said. "Big," the boy said. "And careful. He said you were the most careful man he'd ever trailed with." Rosalie felt Wade absorb that. She was standing close enough to him that she felt it in him before she saw it in his face. The slow landing of something that had been in the air for 4 years and had finally reached the ground. "Your father was right," Wade said. "He was the better man of the 2 of us." The boy considered this with the gravity of 9 years old. "Mama says you're both good men," he said finally. "She says that's not a competition." Rosalie decided in that moment that she liked Clara very much. They stayed 3 days. They sat on the porch in the evenings and talked, and were quiet in turns, which was the right balance. Wade told stories about the trail drives. Clara told stories about her husband that none of them had heard before, small stories, the particular way he laughed at his own jokes before he finished them, his lifelong inability to whistle the argument they'd had about which direction true north was, that had lasted the better part of a winter. On the last evening, Wade and Clara's mother-in-law sat together on the porch while Clara put the children to bed. Rosalie stayed at the kitchen table with her coffee and did not go out because some conversations needed to happen without witnesses. When Wade came inside later, he sat down across from her and was quiet for a moment. "She told me something," he said. "You don't have to tell me. I want to." He looked at the table. "She said that her son used to say that a good man isn't one who never makes the wrong call. It's one who carries it correctly after. She said she'd been watching me for 4 years through letters from people who knew me, and she thought I'd been carrying it correctly." Rosalie looked at him. "She's right," she said. He looked up. "You don't know everything, I know you," she said. "I know you well enough. The rest is detail." He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and between them was everything that had accumulated since a milk wagon pulled up to a gate at first light, and a man with flour on his shirt asked an impossible question, and a woman who had been alone for 3 years walked into his kitchen anyway. They went home in late April, back through the flatness into the hills, and the valley received them the way it received everything, with the patient, opinionated steadiness of land that has seen generations come and do their work and go. The following autumn, Rosalie opened the rural school. It was in a room attached to the cooperative's main building, not a separate structure, not yet, but a room with a door that closed and desks that Wade had built himself over the winter, and a blackboard that Mrs. Patterson had donated, with the kind of quiet authority of a woman who has been waiting for someone to ask the right question for a long time. The first class was 11 children from Valley Farms, ranging in age from 7 to 14, coming 3 mornings a week on the days their family work allowed. She taught reading and writing, and the arithmetic she had promised herself she would teach weights and measures, interest rates, contract terms, the specific mathematics of knowing what you were owed and whether you were getting it. On the first morning, she stood at the blackboard with 11 children looking at her, and felt something she had not felt since her father died. Something that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the difference between enduring a life and living it. She taught. Years later, when people in the valley talked about how things changed, and they did talk about it the way people in small valleys talk about things that matter to them. For a long time, they talked about the cooperative and the railroad contract and the Bell conviction and the school. They talked about Rosalie Bennett's name on the cooperative charter and Wade Callahan's creek crossing and Agnes's account books. But the story always started the same way. It started with a milk wagon and a gate, and a man standing in a doorway with flour on his shirt. And years after that first morning, on a day that was crisp and ordinary and entirely good, Rosalie drove the route before dawn the way she always had. Same time, same road, same cold. Bess knowing the ruts by feel, the milk bottles counting themselves against the wood by sound. She pulled up to the Callahan gate. The kitchen light was on. It was always on. She climbed down with 2 bottles and walked up to the porch, and Wade was there in the doorway with his coffee. No flour this time, the particular ease of a man who is exactly where he belongs. "Fresh milk," she said. 10 cents a bottle. He looked at her over the rim of his cup, and his eyes were everything they had always been: careful, warm, direct, entirely his. "I'll take both," he said, "if the milkmaid will join me for breakfast." Rosalie stepped up onto the porch and looked at him with the expression she reserved for the moments she was happiest and least interested in performing anything about it. "I'll stay," she said, "for exactly as long as the biscuits are right." "They're right," he said. "Then I'm staying." Behind them in the kitchen, they had built into something real together. The long table, the good coffee, the window that caught the first light, the smell of bread that had risen. The way bread is supposed to rise, the valley woke up to another morning and got to work. And that was exactly what they had made it for.